Official statistics show us that 2,300 people go missing every day in the USA alone. 99% of these cases are solved within 12 months, 91% of them within 48 hours. But what about the other 1% of cases? You wouldn't think it was possible for a person to disappear without a trace. But in this video, we will look at 4 creepy disappearances that have never been solved. On Father's Day weekend, 1969, 6-year-old Dennis Martin set out with his father, grandfather and older brother for their annual family hike in the Great Smoky Mountain National Park, Tennessee. After camping overnight in an area called Russell Field, they hiked to Spence Field near the Appalachian Trail, where they planned to spend the night. During a game of hide and seek, Dennis snuck behind a bush where he disappeared and was never seen again. What ensued is one of the largest search efforts in the park's history, with 1,400 searchers scouring a 56 square mile area. Hampered by heavy rain and rough terrain, this seems like a run-of-the-mill lost in the woods story until you start to delve deeper. As the Martin family sat taking in the surroundings of Spence Field, they were approached by a couple and their children. As Bill Martin, Dennis's father, introduced himself and his family, the couple explained that they were also called the Martins, an odd coincidence. They asked if their children could play together, to which Bill agreed. The children began playing hide and seek, planning to run into the bushes surrounding the field and jump out to scare the adults. Dennis's brother and the 2 other boys went one way, and on their request, Dennis went the other. A healthy, robust child, Dennis Martin was used to hiking and the wilderness, and he knew not to wander too far. His father witnessed him walking behind a bush, and after a few minutes, the other children jumped out on the adults. Dennis did not. His father started to search the immediate area, and there was no sign of Dennis. He ran 2 miles up the Appalachian Trail, frantically searching for any signs of his son. He found nothing. They then called in the National Park Rangers for help. The first point to note is that the other Martin family were never questioned and cannot be found to this day. With a case like this, one of the key resources are tracker dogs. These are brought in almost immediately to pick up the missing person's scent and track them down, sometimes following a trail for miles. But what do you do if the tracker dogs cannot find a trail or refuse to follow it? What happens if these highly trained animals actively sit down and refuse to work? Well, this is what happened during the search for Dennis Martin. The dogs either couldn't find a trace of him, or when they did, actively refused to follow the trail, whining, sitting, and lying down. This was the first in a string of strange occurrences during the search. Completely unaware of the little boy's disappearance, the Key family were hiking 6 miles away from the Martins, around Rowan's Creek, looking for wildlife. They stopped a park ranger and asked where they were likely to see some bears. He pointed them up the creek and told them that was the direction they were likely to encounter animals. After a short hike of a mile or two, the Key family was stopped in their tracks by what they describe as an enormous, sickening scream. Stood still, attempting to make sense of this, the youngest boy in the group tugged on his father's arm, saying, "Look, Dad, there is a bear walking there." Harold Key looked in the direction of his son's pointing and saw a human-like figure walking on two legs. He explained that it wasn't a bear. He didn't know what it was. The entire Key family observed this, and all independently noticed that whoever was walking had something slung over their shoulder. Clueless of the events unfolding 6 miles away, they chalked it up to an odd experience and went home. The next day, they saw the story of Dennis Martin on the front of the local newspaper. Harold Key realized how close they had been and felt he had to say something. He contacted the FBI agent who was working on the case and told their story. After meeting with the FBI agent at the park, their evidence was dismissed as they said it didn't fit into the timeline of events. Bill Martin was never told about this meeting or what the Key family had seen. He found out days later from a journalist. Why would the FBI hide this from him? Their explanation? That it was irrelevant as it didn't fit the timeline. A tracker overheard this conversation and later spoke to Bill. He explained his concerns that the FBI were lying. He knew the area like the back of his hand. He knew that that hike could be made well within the timeline and he could prove it. They went together and easily hiked from the location of the disappearance to the creek where the Keys had their encounter. The Key family encounter is still not in any official record of the case. In the days immediately after Dennis's disappearance, all manner of official agencies were involved in the search. One that stuck out as particularly strange were the Green Berets, a unit of Special Forces soldiers who were fully armed and would not tell anyone, including the FBI, why they were there. It is unheard of for Green Berets to be involved in the search for a single missing civilian, especially fully armed. These are highly trained troops that were known to be able to find anything, anywhere, no matter the conditions or terrain. Yet they could still not find a trace of Dennis, or if they did, they never told anyone about it. Research has been done, and it has been discovered that in the history of the Green Berets, they have only assisted on 4 civilian missing persons cases. 2 of these involved a dangerous armed perpetrator. One was Dennis, and the other had striking similarities to this case in the local vicinity. So out of thousands of missing persons cases since the early 60s, they have assisted on 4. Why was the Dennis Martin case one of these? We will probably never know. Remember the FBI agent I mentioned earlier? He was the point of contact for this case. But he didn't only work on the Dennis Martin disappearance. He was in charge of investigating a further 12 unexplained disappearances within his jurisdiction. Unfortunately, we will never be able to ask him questions about the cases or any possible links, because the FBI agent committed suicide. So what actually happened to Dennis Martin? If you believe the official story, he was taken by wildlife. But how could this have happened without any of the people there hearing a single noise? If you dig deeper, the unofficial story is that Dennis was abducted. Trackers that worked on the case, rangers, and even Bill Martin believe he was taken by a wild man, a person who lives completely off the grid within the national parks. But if this was the case, why would no one talk about it? Why would the authorities try and hide this information? Could it be that the $800 million a year that the Smoky Mountain Park generates is too great to jeopardize? Would stories of homicidal wild men roaming the woods stop visitors coming? The answer is, we don't know. But what we do know is that on June 14th, 1969, Dennis Martin ran behind a bush to play and disappeared without a trace. Brandon Lawson was a 5'9" oil field worker and father of 4 who lived with his long-term girlfriend. On August the 8th, 2013, Brandon and his girlfriend got into an argument which led him to leave their apartment just before midnight to spend the night at his father's to cool off. Around 45 minutes after leaving his home, Brandon called his brother to tell him that he had run out of petrol and needed assistance. He was never seen again. Brandon had seemingly disappeared without a trace. But what makes this case even more haunting is the 911 call Brandon placed before he vanished for good. The timeline for this case can seem difficult to follow, and some parts don't seem to add up. But here is what we do know. Brandon was travelling on Highway 277 when his truck ran out of petrol. At around 12:40, he called his brother to tell him he had run out of gas and needed help. At around 12:50, Brandon called 911 and sounded out of breath and in distress. His truck was abandoned in a haphazard way as he presumably struggled to get off the road. Just before 1 a.m, a trucker placed a call to emergency dispatchers, telling them he had driven past a vehicle on the highway that was causing a hazard. A state trooper was dispatched to investigate the abandoned truck. He and Brandon's brother arrived at the truck at roughly the same time, 1:10 a.m. The truck was unlocked with no keys inside. This is where things get slightly confusing. As Brandon's brother stood with the state trooper, he apparently got a phone call from Brandon. The call was difficult to hear as the phone signal was so bad, but his brother thought Brandon was hiding from the trooper as he had recently discovered he had an outstanding arrest warrant. His brother also thought he heard him say he was bleeding, but he assumed this was from the bushes where he was hiding. He didn't mention this call to the trooper as he was worried he would get arrested. Tragically, neither Brandon's brother or the trooper knew at this time that Brandon had called 911 himself, sounding extremely distressed and asking for help. The trooper arranged a tow truck and Brandon's brother drove on to get petrol, in the hopes of seeing Brandon on the way and picking him up. By the time he got back to the truck, there was still no sign of him, and he was starting to get worried. Later that morning, it was clear Brandon was missing, and the family and police began searching. There was no evidence of foul play at the scene, and the police searched the stretch of highway without finding anything. Only after his long-term girlfriend reviewed phone records days later did they realise that Brandon had made a call to 911. The call is difficult to make out, and there are many theories surrounding its contents. Let's take a listen.
2013 0:50 and 38 seconds.
911 emergency.
Yes, I'm in the middle of the field. The Staples just pushed some guys over. Right here going towards Javelin on both sides. My truck ran out of gas. There's one car here that got chasing to the woods. Please hurry.
Okay, now run that by me.
I'm not talking to him. I actually ran into him.
Ah, you ran into him. Okay.
That's the first guy.
Do you need an ambulance?
Yeah, no, I need the cops.
Okay. Is anybody hurt? Hello? 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 Ah, you ran into him. Okay.
That's the first guy.
Do you need an ambulance? Ah, you ran into him. Okay.
That's the first guy.
Do you need an ambulance? Ah, you ran into him. Okay.
That's the first guy.
Do you need an ambulance? Ah, you ran into him. Okay.
That's the first guy.
Do you need an ambulance?
Brandon has a strong accent, so most of the call is difficult to transcribe. But what is obvious is that he seems distressed and in need of assistance. There is so much debate regarding what could have happened, ranging from Brandon stumbling upon people engaged in illegal activity to him being high or drunk and imagining things. Some people are adamant that the phone call was tampered with before being released to the public, while others believe that his brother knows more than he is letting on. Eventually, they managed to track his phone to its last known location through records, and it was 3 miles away from where his truck was discovered. Months later, cadaver dogs were used to scour the area and did not find a trace of Brandon. There has been no further break in the case to find Brandon Lawson, and no evidence has ever been found. He simply disappeared without a trace. This case has some creepy similarities to the Brandon Lawson disappearance, and not just in the names. Brandon Swanson was 19 and lived with his parents in Marshall, Minnesota. On the 14th of May 2008, Brandon was celebrating his last day of college with friends at a party. Just after midnight, he called his parents asking for a ride, as he had accidentally driven his car into a ditch on the way home from the party. Brian and Annette Swanson immediately set out to collect their son. Going off Brandon's descriptions of the area, and knowing the surrounding routes very well, they all assumed that they knew where to meet each other. His parents drove to the area where they suspected the accident happened, but when they arrived, they couldn't find Brandon. Having only been 10 minutes from their house, it seemed unlikely that he managed to get the car moving. They had been on the phone with him the entire time and were absolutely positive of where he was. They told him they couldn't see him or his truck, so would start flashing their lights so he could spot them. He couldn't see them, so started flashing his own lights in the hopes that his parents could find him, with little success. They couldn't seem to locate each other. His parents were growing increasingly frustrated, as was Brandon, so they ended the call. After a few minutes of searching, his dad called him back to apologize for getting angry. Brandon informed him that he had started walking back to his friend's house and he could see lights from the town of Lind. Brian dropped Annette back at home, then set off to collect his son on the route to his friends. He called Brandon and was on the phone with him asking for updates on his position. Brandon told him to meet him in the local nightclub parking lot, which was a popular pickup spot. As his father was driving there, he carried on a conversation with Brandon. At the 47-minute mark, Brandon shouted, "Oh shit," and the line went dead. That was the last time they spoke to him. They called his phone repeatedly, but he never answered again. They started to call his friends to help search, and they spent all night into the early hours driving down dirt roads and farmland to try and find him. There was no sign. At 6:30 a.m, Brandon's mum called the police to report him missing. The response from the police was delayed, as he was 19 and they deemed it usual for someone his age to disappear after a night out. They said he had a right to be missing. It took hours for them to join the search. When they eventually kicked into action, they first looked at his phone records, and it threw up something completely unexpected. The last ping on his mobile phone was not near Lind at all. It was over 20 miles away from his suspected location. That afternoon, the police found his car 25 miles away from Lind, in a ditch, as Brandon had said. There was no evidence of foul play, and they couldn't ascertain which direction he had walked after leaving his car. 500 volunteers, including 34 dog handlers from 9 different states, spent more than 120 days searching for Brandon and covered 120 square miles. They found nothing. All they could do was theorize, and they decided that Brandon had fallen into a river, even though there was no evidence that he had even been near the river, and an extensive search of the water found nothing. His parents do not believe he fell into the river. Search dogs followed his scent for 3 miles towards an abandoned farm before losing it. They never indicated anything near the river. People cannot just vanish into thin air. But in the case of Brandon Swanson, it seems this is the case. Not even any of his belongings were ever found. It has been nearly a decade since his disappearance, and his parents still leave their porch light on in the hope that one day he will come home. When we talk about people vanishing without a trace, it somehow seems more plausible in the USA, with such a vast area for people to disappear. But when we hear about people vanishing without a trace in England, it doesn't seem possible. England is one of the most CCTV covered countries in the world. Couple this with a small landmass and the fact that it is an island, and it just seems so improbable. But it still happens. There are lists of people who have simply gone, with no trace or evidence. One of these cases is 16-year-old Jordan Ratcliffe, a normal teenager from Moston, Greater Manchester, who enjoyed shopping and spending time with his friends. Jordan asked his aunt to drop him off in Manchester city centre. She obliged at 4:45 p.m. on the 31st of August 2008. He was never seen again. What makes this case one of the most creepy on the list is the sheer lack of anything. There is no evidence. It seems that he was dropped off, then vanished. The police have drained canals and searched up and down the country, all to no avail. It is highly unlikely that a 16-year-old with limited funds would have been able to leave the country, and there has never been a confirmed sighting of Jordan again. After being missing for 6 years, an apparent sighting of Jordan was made in Portsmouth, which is nearly 250 miles away, but this was never confirmed. His family still believe that Jordan is alive and appeal for him to get in contact. But after nearly 10 years, there is still no trace and no explanation as to what happened that day. This was a look at 4 creepy, unexplained disappearances. If you have any information regarding any of the cases on this list, please see the description below for contact details of the agencies investigating. Thanks for watching this video. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss anything from Everything Creepy. If you have any suggestions for a creepy video, leave us a comment below.